Welcome to the BrainShape podcast, hosted by Dr. Andrea Wilkinson, a show where we cut through the noise of the ever-growing, ever-changing world of brain health. What works and what doesn't, what's fact and what's fiction. We look at tips, tools, and techniques backed up by real scientific studies to help you keep your brain healthy and hopefully have some fun along the way. Now, here's your host, Dr. Andrea Wilkinson.
You're listening to the BrainShape podcast, episode number 22. Today is the conclusion of our 3-part series on happy brain chemicals. If you've missed the last 2 weeks of the podcast, I strongly suggest that you go back and listen to the 3-part series in order, starting with episode number 20. In today's episode, we'll be taking a deeper dive into the content covered in some of Dr. Breuning's books, including Habits of a Happy Brain, Tame Your Anxiety, and The Science of Positivity. We'll also touch on her podcast, The Happy Brain. Dr. Loretta Breuning is the founder of the Inner Mammal Institute, which helps people manage the ups and downs of their mammal brain. She is also a professor emerita of management at California State University, East Bay, and the author of 8 books, including Habits of a Happy Brain, which talks about the brain chemicals that make us feel good and how to stimulate them naturally. For the last time, here we go. Here's Dr. Loretta Breuning. So I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit about your book, Habits of a Happy Brain, and maybe talk about sort of the book, the context in general, and then what sort of, if there's a couple of key strategies that you talk about in the book that you think might be helpful for listeners.
Sure. Habits of a Happy Brain, retrain your brain to boost your serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, and endorphin levels. That's the whole title, and it's available in all the usual places and lots of information on my website, innermammalinstitute.org. So the book is actually very similar to our conversation here. It explains how the chemicals work in nature, how we've inherited this brain so we have 2 brains. I'll just do the parts that I didn't do here.
Yeah.
So we have 2 brains, a limbic system inherited from earlier animals and a uniquely human cortex, which is basically like a reserve of neurons, like I'm trying to think the computer, extra RAM, like that's just not coded,
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do with those extra neurons? Well, it all depends on how we hook them up. Otherwise, they're just, dead space. So the important thing at the end of the book, I go into the trade-offs because I mentioned a little bit the trade-off between dopamine and oxytocin, the trade-off between serotonin and oxytocin. So we're always having to make these difficult decisions. There's also a trade-off between the short run and the long run. So if I do something, it's going to release happy chemicals right now, but then I'm going to feel better. I'm going to feel bad about it later on, or I'm going to miss out on something good later on because I focused on this good thing right now. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of like a conflict between your mammal brain that wants what feels good right now, and your human brain can anticipate the future and can say, if you give up this reward right now, you can have a bigger reward later on.
Right.
Yeah. So, and the other big thing is, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's so hard for many people to believe that this is how their brain actually works, because all of us have some other belief, because, you have to have some belief, Mm-hmm. So it's hard to think that your verbal brain is not in charge. So there are the things you say to yourself in words, and that all comes from your verbal cortex because your mammal brain is not able to process language. So it cannot tell you in words what is going on. So many people, they have this feeling of like, well, I thought one thing in words, but then I did another thing. Why did I do that? Mm-hmm. And many people they don't want to take responsibility for what their mammal brain did. So they find some other way to blame the external world. Somebody tricked me into doing that. It wasn't the real me. It's society's fault that I did this. And it's some learning process to then say, oh, that was my inner mammal, and I am responsible for managing my inner mammal.
Absolutely. I think a really good example of that, just in line of like the context of food, is that our sort of evolutionary brain, our mammal brain, evolved to seek out like sugar in terms of our like food that we would eat, because sugar would actually provide some stimulation to our brain and help us, get stuff done. So we would seek it out. So our brain's like hardwired to be like, oh, there's sugar, ding, 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 like get that. That's really good. The issue is that now, as we all know, it's so prevalent. You can get sugar anywhere, and there's sugar in pretty much everything that we eat, like including ketchup. And so now there's this excess availability of sugar, but we still are hardwired to be like, ding, 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 sugar, get the sugar. And so that's an interesting example.
Also, we get that ding, ding, ding from fat also, instantly. So, and when you think of a newborn baby getting milk, that milk has much higher levels of sugar and fat than anything else in nature. So that's full of what has that immediate reward. Yes, and it's all that today it's so easily available that we could easily get too much. But for our ancestors, it was so hard to get, and you had to invest so much effort to get it that you didn't overeat because it was so much effort.
And because of that, our brains were evolved to be hardwired to seek that out, because people that were sort of primed to locate it and obtain the sugar were the ones that survived and procreated. So it became sort of like built into our brains. And that's sort of an example of how we have to step away from maybe what our lizard brain or our mammal brain wants in terms of what our sort of evolutionary needs are, and step away from that.
Whatever is our automatic, whatever is our immediate automatic impulse of, oh, this is going to feel good.
Yeah.
And then we could say, yeah, I can feel good other ways also. And how can I wire myself to shift my attention from my usual way of feeling good to some other way of feeling good that I've voluntarily chosen? And I think it helps to, like, if you remind yourself that you're voluntarily choosing it.
Yeah. And I actually spoke about this on another episode of my podcast, but I'm just so interested in the idea of habit formation and how that works for people, and how we create habits in our lives, and how do we update habits, build good habits, get rid of bad ones. And James Clear is an author who talks a lot about habit formation, and someone that I follow. And he talks a lot about the difference between good habits and bad habits. Often, if you look at them, the bad habits are often immediately rewarding. So you eat a donut and right now you feel good. Like while you're eating it, you're like, it's delicious and it's gooey and it's sweet. But then the long-term benefits, and sometimes it's even within 5 minutes, you don't feel good after eating it because you maybe have a stomach ache, or you get this like spike in energy and then it drops down to below the level that you started at. And so there's these immediate benefits for quote unquote bad habits, and often more long-term benefits to healthier habits like exercising or eating healthy. You don't see the benefit right away, but over the long term, there's a benefit to exercising and eating well. And so he talks about how when we're building habits, we have to try to think about ways to bring a reward for a good habit into the immediate present. So whether it's by rewarding yourself with a comedy show, or relaxing for 10 minutes after you do an exercise, or whatever it is that, you know, you can bring the reward into the current moment. So you don't have to wait, you know, the 6 months to see the benefit of exercising and eating well.
Yes, that's very good. You know what else I would add that sort of amplifies the whole thing? To use the donut example, when you get to that split second when you decide, you know what? I'm going to get myself a donut. When you give in, you think about it and you think about it and you're like, yeah, I'm going to get it.
Yeah.
So it helps to think of this as a dopamine circuit. And once you say, yeah, I'm going to get that donut. So first I said dopamine is the expectation of a reward. So you're thinking, oh, this is going to feel good. And that's the circuit that's built from your past experience because, when you were a baby and you were hungry, you couldn't get food, you couldn't meet your own needs. And so when that milk just appeared, you're like, wow, that did it. That made me feel better.
Yeah.
So the rest of your life, though, the donut doesn't give you that wow because you've had donuts before. Mm-hmm. So you really don't get that big of a wow. So then you want another donut because you didn't really get that big a response from it. So the minute you start thinking, I want a donut, you start releasing dopamine and it starts feeling good long before you get it in your mouth. And what I always say is like you drive to the donut shop and when you find a parking spot, you're like, yay! Because now there's no more obstacles between me and the donut. Yeah. So when the donut is finally in your mouth, that's it. You don't get any more dopamine. Right. Because you've already sort of used it up. Right. Exactly. And that's why it's sort of so tempting to just want more. Now, one thing that helps us understand this is if you think about your first donut, like when did you first get into this dopamine habit? Or, everyone can substitute whatever the habit is that they have. You can see clearly that, oh, that was a time in my life when something bad was going on and I had a donut and that made me feel better. And that's how the brain works. Anything that makes you feel better, your brain stores it as this is the answer. This will make your pain go away. And that's why we repeat it. Right. Interesting. I wonder what would happen if the dopamine is sort of, in your donut example, you have to drive to the store to get the donut and it's all ramping up when you think about getting the donut, then you drive to the donut place and it's dopamine's increasing. You find the parking spot, so it's like kind of peaking in terms of its levels. What would happen if you just were like, okay, that's it. I'm not even going to get the donut. I just wanted that like incremental dopamine increase and then we're just going to leave it at that. I'm assuming something would feed back into your brain to be like, oh, you didn't satisfy the goal, so I'm not as happy. Yeah, I'll give you an example of that. Do you ever, this happens to me, like sometimes I'm at my desk working and I get up and I walk to the refrigerator and I stand in front of the refrigerator and then I say, why am I here? Yeah. And then I say, oh, what I really wanted is a break. Right. And I say, am I really hungry or is it that I just need a break? I should take a break. Then the next thing is, well, maybe I'm thirsty. Mm-hmm. And then after a while, I'm saying, okay, I took a break. I had some water. Maybe I am really hungry. I'll have a snack. Right. So it's, thinking it through. Right. Thinking it through and then also allowing opportunities for other rewards to come into play that might not just be eating. Other need meeting. Mm-hmm. And you know what? On a deeper level, many people learn when they're young, it's bad to meet your needs because you're selfish. So you should only focus on the needs of others. And if you focus on your own needs, you're bad. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of giving themselves a reward is so fraught that they sort of have this idea of what they're telling their inner mammal is, you're never going to get what you want. Everybody else gets what they want, but not you. Mm-hmm. and that's sort of painful. And if you're telling yourself that, you're sort of living with that pain all the time, and you don't realize that you're causing it yourself. You think the world is doing it to you. So it's really useful to sort of make peace in some way with the fact that your brain evolved to meet your needs. And it's always trying to do that. And if you say my needs don't count, it's because you learned that you got rewarded for saying my needs don't count, but it's really not the best way to do it. And I have a little on that in you know what? I have another book called The Science of Positivity, Stop Negative Thought Patterns by Changing Your Brain Chemistry. And that has more on different causes of negativity and how we can rewire them. And then I have a new book called Tame Your Anxiety that just came out.
Oh, wonderful. And that one obviously is about anxiety. But can you tell us a little bit more about the content of that one?
Sure. So they're all covering the same general stuff, but this one goes into more detail of when you're in a moment of anxiety, you may have read the other books, but you feel like, well, I can't do that now because I'm having a panic attack. How do you expect me to think about the long run while I'm in the middle of a panic attack, for example?
Right.
So this suggests a way of rewiring your autopilot so that it's easier for you to stimulate happy chemicals instead of going into a cortisol surge. So I explain the cause of a cortisol surge from an animal perspective. So I could just briefly, briefly explain that?
Please do. And a little bit about cortisol, because I don't think that listeners will know what that is.
So cortisol is the brain chemical that tells an animal that it's in immediate danger. So the well-known example is that a predator is chasing you, and animals are constantly alert for predator threat. But also hunger is cortisol, because hunger tells you better look for food now, otherwise you're going to starve. And if an animal's being bitten, then cortisol is like an immediate surge of like, whoa, pull your hand back, you're in immediate danger.
Right.
So from a human perspective, I always explain cortisol is designed to protect you from touching a hot stove twice. So if you touch a hot stove once, you pull your hand off and you say, whoa, I'm never going to touch that again. And each of us got wired to anything that caused us pain. It wired your brain to say, whoa, I'm not going to do that again. So some people learn good behavior because, they get punished when they do something bad. But then other things happen, like maybe somebody studies for a math test and gets a bad grade, and they feel threatened, and then their brain says, whoa, I'm not going to study for a math test again, because disappointment is actually cortisol. And I explain this from the point of view of a lion, that if a lion is chasing a gazelle and the lion sees that the gazelle is getting away, it's disappointed. And that's a survival threat, because the lion's going to starve to death if everything gets away. So this tells the lion, like, whoa, this is urgent. So we have all wired ourselves with anything that hurt you in the past. It gives you that urgent feeling of like, whoa, if you do that again, it's going to be terrible. And needless to say, you can wire yourself to think a lot of things are terrible when in fact these things are actually good for you. I guess simple example, to use your food analogy, if you're at a social gathering and somebody says, have a slice of my cake, and like you think it would be rude to say no, but you want to say no.
Right.
So maybe you got wired that, oh, if you turn down somebody's cake, they'll be mad at you or something,
Right, exactly. Or turning down invitations to social events
that you don't really want to go to, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So where our brains are sort of wired to be like, well, you should just go even if you don't really want to, because you don't want to disappoint the herd or let the social group down.
Yes. Yeah. So then I explain what I call a cortisol loop. Mm-hmm. So once a gazelle smells a lion, the gazelle doesn't just run, because then it might run in the wrong direction. So what a gazelle does is scan for information. And that's what we do. Once you get that initial feeling of, uh-oh, this could be bad for me, then you look for information. So what your brain does is it looks for evidence of threat. Mm-hmm. And you have a much bigger brain than a gazelle, so you are very good at looking for evidence of threat. So then once you see evidence of threat, then your brain releases more cortisol. It says, whoa, there really is a lion, and it's close, and it's going to get me, because that's sort of what you've learned. Like, you're only looking for the bad once your cortisol turns on. And that's sort of the tragedy, that we can ruin a perfectly good life by wiring ourselves to look for the bad. So it's a matter of building a circuit that looks for the good and then connecting the good circuit to that moment of threat so that you could go into looking for the good. And there's one more part of it, because that's in Science of Positivity has a lot of that. But then what Tame Your Anxiety goes into, two things. One is how to actually find things to do during that bad moment, because when you're in that bad moment, nothing looks good. You don't really feel like doing anything. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, a gazelle will always live in a world full of predators. It can never say, I don't want to go out until they fix the problem. It's always going to live around predators. So how does it relax? And the way it relaxes is by believing in its own skills. It believes it can escape because it escaped before. So it's basically, how can you believe in your own steps? Because that's ultimately the only true source of calm, is just having confidence in your own actions. So it's like a step-by-step program of how to build that even when you're feeling like you can't.
Right. And it's so important to take those first steps, because you're never going to be able to build the confidence or have the evidence that you're capable if you don't actually execute on the behavior.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And so you've written numerous books. Are there any ones in particular that you wanted to talk about, or you could go through the other few that we have not yet mentioned?
I would start with Habits of a Happy Brain, because it's the most introductory. Mm-hmm. And I've mentioned Tame Your Anxiety and Science of Positivity. And I briefly mentioned Inner Mammal is about social comparison, the urge for social power, the way to make peace with your natural impulse to seek the respect of others, because it's a real thing, and we all have it, and we just have to manage it. We all have to manage it.
Yeah. And all of your books are, so people can find out more about them on your website, which we'll talk about at the end, but also they're available on any online platforms?
Yes, all they're in all the usual places.
Okay. Wonderful.
Oh, and I also wrote a self-published book about political correctness.
Oh, interesting.
Which is available on Amazon. It's called How I Escaped Political Correctness, and You Can Too.
Oh, great. That sounds very interesting. So I know you have a podcast also. So what is it called? What do you talk about? And where can people go to listen?
So it's called The Happy Brain, mm-hmm. and it's at happybrainpodcast.com. And it's answering your questions about all of this. So I look for questions from readers, so I'm happy to hear from people. And I also bring on special guests that know something about one aspect of this or another. But this is not what I'm talking about. There's no group it's not like an accepted, established thing. So there's no one else practicing this except me. But people may have information about one facet or another.
And how often does it come out?
Every 2 weeks.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. Well, I know that our listeners love podcasts, so I hope that they go and check out your podcast called The Happy Brain.
Thanks. And it's very nice of you to promote another podcast. And a good place to start, though, is I have a video series. When I say a series, each one is only 5 minutes long. So if you want to get a 5-minute introduction, and then there's a series of 7 of these 5-minute videos, and it's a especially good way to give this information to someone in your life who doesn't like to read, because I've made them funny.
Right. Yes, you are very entertaining. I have watched several of your videos, so
Thank you.
I'm sure the listeners will enjoy that.
Thank you.
So I wanted to thank you so much, Loretta, for your time and sharing your expertise and all of this wonderful information about brain chemicals and how it is that we can sort of understand how that's working in our brain sort of behind the scenes, and then how we can then, using that knowledge, take steps to make improvements on how our brain chemicals are increasing and decreasing in our own brains. So I know that our listeners will probably be really keen to follow you. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your website. I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier.
Sure. Thank you so much. So it's innermammalinstitute.org, innermammalinstitute.org. And you'll see in the navigation at the top, there's my videos, my podcasts, my books, information about my blogs and all my other media appearances, and some special interest stuff, and a form to contact me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Loretta. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for all the great questions and for having understood all the material.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I am so happy that you took the time to speak with us today.
Great. Well, thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To learn more about the work that Dr. Loretta Breuning is doing on happy brain chemicals, you can visit her website at innermammalinstitute.org. I'll put the link in the show notes. On her website, you'll find information about all of the wonderful content she creates to teach people about our brain chemicals, including information on her many books, her podcast, The Happy Brain, and her video series. If you've missed any of this, you can dive into the show notes for this episode and all past episodes at www.brainshape.ca/podcast. To access the show notes from today's episode specifically, just type episode 22 in the search bar, and today's episode will pop right up. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that this 3-part series gave you a better understanding of the happy chemicals that we have in our brains, how they forge the way for our neural networks, and how our everyday actions can trigger and stimulate them naturally. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you'll be notified every time we publish a new episode. And since we're a weekly show, I'll see you back here next week. In the meantime, you can follow me on social media at BrainShapeTO, and be sure to let me know if there are any specific topics that you want me to cover on the podcast. Until next time, keep your brain in shape. And as always, it's been such a pleasure hanging out with you.